document what he got from where. It wasn't this malicious idea of stealing ideas that, after his fight with Hooke, that got, it did spool up a little bit like that. But in the beginning, he just read everything, current works, old works, esoteric works, works of, his colleagues, took what he could use, and he mostly wanted to do it for his own sake. He was driven to find out how the world worked. And yet, it's just like even now, you and I might talk about water bridge experiment and forget who presented that. What conference did we see that at? I don't remember even myself.
It was Bob Johnson at EU 2012, I think, something like that.
Right, but my point though is that, like, if we're just learning for our own sake, it's not. We'll take what we can use. We only get in trouble if we go putting that with something else and then saying it without giving credit. And that's what Newton did. Basically, he just had all these ideas. He took the ones he could use, put two and two together. And like I say, Newton was very well read, but he was one of the crappiest scientists out there. There's just no other way to say it. He dabbled in everything, hardly wrote anything down, didn't repeat experiments after his own satisfaction. He wasn't very rigorous after that. But that not writing things down, especially, it got him in trouble. And that's where the idea that he stole people's work and didn't give them credit for it, it wasn't those malicious as people might interpret.
So you're saying basically that in terms of like crappy scientist, do you mean that he wasn't like super diligent, like super conscientious?
Yeah, he was interested in so many things. Like if you look at his contemporaries, they picked, I mean, some of them were too, interested in a lot of different topics, but they at least picked a few, worked on them. Like Hooke was really good at experiments and, writing everything down and that kind of stuff. And Newton was here, he was there, he put this on a back burner and just, his experiments were dabbling in things and he just had a lot of interest, jumped around, but like I say, he didn't have that drive to publish, and his personality, because of things that, like his dad dying when he was young, his mom ran off with another guy who basically didn't want him. So he was well taken care of, but he felt abandoned, and he was pretty much a fragile person, didn't like his ideas being challenged, and that's why he didn't like publishing. And if he got any criticism, which you should expect when you're a scientist, he would either like withdraw or else he would lash out and, be pretty nasty. And because he was a little bit above average intelligence, he could be pretty ferocious when he was in a mean-spirited way.
Okay.
But if you go back to the time, like when he was working on the pushing gravity idea, is the one that got abandoned. And see, this is where people get stories mixed up. They now that he might have been a closet homosexual, and they get that idea from the fact that he never got married. He wrote that there were reasons maybe he shouldn't ever get married, and the big one though is he invited that young guy to live with him, and then when that guy didn't, he was all depressed. So that's the takeaway everybody has. But the truth of the matter is, Newton did fall in love, but above his station in his younger day, with a woman, and that didn't work out. The reason he said he would probably never marry is there's another story in that his niece came to live with him. His niece was a very beautiful and charming woman, and there was a lot going on there. That's what he didn't want to write about, but their feelings of affection for each other went, beyond uncle and niece. And that was never acknowledged. But when he wanted that young man to come live with him, that's the important point, is that this fascio, if I'm pronouncing it right in modern times, he was, that was the guy that was big on pushing gravity, this idea that gravity was like a pressure from this medium. And Newton was on his page. Newton was working with him on that. And the reason he wanted him to move in with him is because in those days, you know, they didn't have the internet, obviously. If someone lived even across, you know, outside your town, it was snail mail. You posted ideas, and it was really hard to share things. He wanted him to move in until they got the gravity thing down. That's what drove Newton, and that's why he was so despondent, because that really killed that whole thing. And that's what ended up leading to the idea where Newton's still banking closer on that pushing gravity idea, because it got away from the action at a distance idea that he didn't like. But after that relationship went the way it did, both those guys felt abandoned, because Newton, he threw up his hand, said, "I frame no hypothesis." And that other young guy was let down because Newton, he was counting on Newton to get that idea out there. And as soon as Newton said, "I frame no hypothesis," because everybody respected Newton so much at the time, that's the reason we don't have that pushing gravity idea. It's only slowly getting resurrected and reconsidered now, but that's when it kind of went by the way.
Yeah. Yeah, so, I see the idea, sure.
But that still was where we should be with it even now. And now with, like, if you look at the relationships like Hooke and Newton, as far as their personalities, you might ask what Hooke was like, what Newton was like, but really Hooke, to some people, was kind of the nicer guy of the two. But what Hooke was really like is if you liked his theories, he was really cool. If you didn't, he didn't have much use for you at all. And Newton was the one to point out where Hooke made a few blunders, and Newton didn't waste any time pointing that out. So that was their relationship pretty much. So Hooke, probably the more nicer guy, because Newton was always like this shy loner, pretty much antisocial, more likely to walk around in a group of college students, at the time, and drawing figures on the ground, trying to figure stuff out, and oblivious to people around him. Whereas Hooke was, in general, maybe a nicer character, but then, you'd see people like that in the science community, or even EU community, even now, where if their ideas are challenged, while they're normally a very nice person, they might tend to block or shut down anybody who has conflicting ideas. And, that some of these same characteristics are apparent in people even now,
Yeah, well, that's roughly the impression I got from, again, superficially studying their relationships. Again, I'm not claiming to be any sort of expert on this. I really only spent a very short amount of time on that, so can't really judge. And plus, again, there's this whole general point that so much time has passed, firstly, and secondly, it's all like mostly like, I don't even know how to call it, like third-party accounts or whatever. And obviously both of them are pretty influential, so both of them had their own cliques, so to speak, their own fan clubs, at least at some point in their life. So, like, yeah. And add to that, like, the inherent complexity of human relationships, right? When like, even now, one person can tell you one thing and another person completely other thing. So, yeah, there you go.
Yeah, and Newton did have a when when he got the Queen's favor at the time, that really, again, because he really wanted to know how everything worked. He wanted everybody's data, and that got him in trouble. Like when he used the Queen's influence to get him to force another scientist to publish before there were
Was it
read.
the Queen back then, not a king? I don't know.
Yeah, it was the Queen that really he really had her she was the one that admired him at any rate, and that's why he got to do got away with some of the stuff that he probably shouldn't have gotten away with. But again, he gets somebody to publish just so he can have their data, whereas that was their life's work, and they wanted to double check the data, and he just wanted to know basically what's in there. I want to read it now, and didn't care if the person made a mistake. And that person did end up making a couple of mistakes, and then kind of suffered their reputation because of that. And also that Newton could just have a look at it and see if his pet theory matched the observations or not. But again, not probably seeming a lot more malicious than it was. Is well, I guess it is. If you're more focused on wanting to know things than the people that are around you, and that's the epitome of who Newton was. That was like his weakness.
Technically, it's called psychopathy, right? When you don't care about what people think or feel, like you're just into some stuff.
Right. Yeah, that's like the issue. And if he would have been a little more focused on relationships with any of those people, and not but again, like I say, that his childhood alone kind of shaped a lot that feeling of abandonment, and then being a loner is that just affected science a lot more than we'd like to think.
Yeah, but wasn't it like I'm judging from my own perspective of like studying how scientific ideas get popular and stuff. Like, wasn't it actually these other people who actually supported Newton, including like the royal family or whatnot, who actually made him really, really popular? Like, he wouldn't be able to achieve like so much stuff on his own if he wasn't at least somewhat popular in some circles. I mean, if nobody, read and published his books, like nobody would know who the hell he is and stuff. You know what I'm saying?
Right. And he did have, like, even in his days in Cambridge, he had, well, even how he got into Cambridge was with somebody noting that he seemed to have potential, and kind of he had a lot of people like that throughout his days, and other scientists that were, like I say, read something that he was dabbling in, and pushed him to publish on that. And yeah, I don't know.
Well, I mean, my point was related to your point about how like Newton's childhood like significantly impacted physics and stuff. Like my counterpoint was that if his ideas weren't having some other appeal to other people, in fact, many other people, or at least many people in power, then they wouldn't be promoted so much. That was my point. So, you know.
Oh, right. Yeah.
So there was at least something else in his ideas rather than his like poor childhood that was appealing to people, right? So
Yeah, like, well, his earliest work especially was pretty good. His work in optics, and even some of his stuff on gravity. Just like I say, it didn't come as much out of a vacuum as some people think. if Hooke had the inverse square thing down and Kepler had the, well, just like the idea of calculus. Calculus, now there's an argument over who stole calculus from the other person. But if you see what they grew, what those ideas grew out of, it was just inevitable that if one of those two didn't do it, somebody else would have very soon, because of everything was set up. Kepler himself and then a couple of others working on that idea for the area of a swept out. That was already calculus to do it. I mean, not officially calculus, but the whole problem was already set up, and to find that area inside that curve, that's what everybody was working on. And once you see that, then it was inevitable that these guys came up with fairly similar but different ideas at about the same time. It wasn't that they stole the ideas from the other. It was just right for the, someone with a mathematical mind to get it.
Yeah, I would agree probably. And if you look at the formulations and even the notation, they're kind of different in Newton and Leibniz. Even though you could also argue that Leibniz also had like a more broader philosophical system already, or maybe not already, I'm not sure when it was published. But he was working on this, theory of monads, like, some basically like atom-like entities or something like that. So, yeah, but in general, I would agree that they're probably independently arrived at these same ideas. Not even the same ideas, actually, slightly different, but allowing to solve basically the same mathematical problems.
Right. And that's another example again of where Newton was just a little less rigorous. That would be the nice way to say it, in his, formula. Everything that wasn't the only thing he was interested in at all, and he was sloppy again, so.
Yeah, I'm also came to know sometime before. Well, it's a fairly well-known fact that Newton also worked on new chronology, right? Like a revised chronology of like ancient Egypt, I think. Or it could have
Right.
been not only ancient Egypt but other places.
Yeah, that's one that's always fascinated me, is because if you look at all these scientists, and even like in the early 1900s, that came up again with, was it Mahler, and on the other side of the world with E.th.ph, who was Swami E.th.ph, but he was also one of the best astronomers in that tradition, and he came up with, somewhere along the way timelines got really messed up, and so I just think that's kind of. But all these guys really dabbled in the chronology and trying to fix what happened with with their timelines in their various perspectives. Obviously, one trying to fix the Yuga cycle, and the other one trying to make sense of biblical timelines, and that was basically the difference. But they already saw errors.
Yeah, and it was a time when it wasn't really as solidly established as today, so it was probably much more acceptable. At least not much more, maybe, but somewhat more.
Right. Yeah. Although even then he got, Newton was in a bit of trouble for. Well, he knew where you didn't go, what you didn't write about, and he left a lot of stuff encoded too, with heretical ideas. Like he was still in a time where you didn't say anything that the church didn't want you to say.
Yeah, though England had its own church already back then, but it was basically the same Catholicism anyway, except for the
Right.
name.
Yeah, it was the same. Yeah, dogmatic religion where you didn't you didn't want to go up against teachings. But he had access to a lot of the, banned books at the time, and you can see that. You can see a lot of his writing, what he tried to put encrypted, and other ideas that he had that clearly weren't his own ideas that had appeared and disappeared before. So that's really, he was just one of the most well-read guys of his time, not the best scientist at all. But
Yeah.
you made a comment on this too, and I think that standing on the shoulder of giants comment, that was, I think, meant both ways, both as a bash to Hooke's physical stature, but also Newton basically always said, "I'm not the sharpest guy out there. I just work really hard." He said that in different ways over and over, and he really believed that was true. He wasn't being like self-deprecating by saying that. He was being he knew how hard he researched, how much he read, how he gave up a lot of other things while everybody else was out enjoying themselves. And
yeah, well, in general, I'm sorry for interrupting, but in general, this perspective that you gave, that he wasn't as orderly, he wasn't as diligent, it's actually kind of new to me. I thought he was actually, on the contrary, like very, very scrupulous and stuff. So actually, I'm kind of surprised by this other view.
yeah, see, well, a lot of times if you look at who was getting, when he was forced to publish, that's his not wanting to be attacked did make him, at that point, like not when he was doing his research and stuff, but when he had to publish, he did get a little bit more cautious. But a lot of that, again, was driven, like I say, by other people. And even there was a lot of defense of him by people that wanted, again, his ideas, since they were critical to that thinking about gravity being a pressure. So anybody who was on that page wanted him to put that stuff out there. But yeah, Newton not the type to just say, "Ooh, look at me! I'm so smart. This is what I thought up." That's not what he was like with any of that stuff. So,
well, I meant not only that, but in general, like the manner of work, like I don't know how else to formulate this. The style of work. So I mean, like everyday work, like everyday research that you don't necessarily even publish. Like you sound like almost like he was like reading one book and then like 10 minutes later taking some other book and starting to read it randomly as well, and then switching to some third one or something, like not really making any notes or anything. Like he was almost a pretty chaotic guy.
yeah, well, there's even stories out there from his time about like when the whole idea of the inverse square law and the elliptical orbits, that they were having a meeting with other scientists at the time, these guys, and they asked him, and he just said point blank, yeah, that's where the inverse, the elliptical orbits come from, that inverse square gravity. And they're like, "How do you know this?" And he's like, he went back to look for where he had it written down, and he didn't find it, so he had to work it out all over again. But that's more what Newton was like as a scientist.
Okay, that's fairly new again to me, anyway. So
Yeah,
good stuff.
he spent a lot of time too on the, like, well, when you have that many different interests, he was in his youngest day before Cambridge, he was really he was taken under the wings of the local, what do you call it, apothecary, like where they're basically making drugs and tinctures and stuff in the day, and he learned a lot of
pharmacy or something. I don't
yeah, yeah, basically. And he learned a lot of his chemistry from there, but also some of the underground books that guy had, like a little more esoteric stuff that was banned. So, but he was interested in like so many things, and then church history and the idea of the Trinity, and that he wrote a lot on. And you can tell from that even that you can't be all too rigorous on everything that you're doing if you're into that, if you're really doing optics and gravity and developing calculus and writing on theology. Obviously, you're getting ideas from different people that you're putting together. That's where that idea of is he stealing ideas? No, he just read everything, and obviously you're not as rigorous as you could be in any one area. His again, just optics and gravity. When he put those two works out, those were like his best moments as a scientist. But again, with a lot of pressure to do that, and a lot of really behind the scenes help too to get those to where they were out there.
Yeah, well, many people were interested in these things. Again, Descartes himself made a book about optics, actually maybe more than one, but I definitely remember like it's called Dioptica in Latin, like dioptrics basically. It was one. Then Hooke obviously also wrote about this, and many other people. I mean, it was a fairly already well-established area, right? Ever since Galileo, at least. And obviously, people had telescopes even before Galileo because of warfare, right? Like you need to observe the enemy army from far away, so you need a good telescope. That's one thing I wanted to note, that these were in general popular topics at that time. But another thing I wanted to note is more general, like the thing you spoke about, how he again conducted his research, that he wasn't super rigorous in any of these areas. Well, I think it's actually to a degree caused by the development of science itself. Like it was only starting back then, right? So it was kind of a mixture of all kinds of stuff. And obviously today, when you're specializing in any single area, you already have all these other areas sort of around you, supporting you and stuff, but they're just not explicitly there, or at least not necessarily, right? Think about mathematics at the very least, right? You can't do too much in some special branch of physics if you don't even have mathematics, let alone like multitude of observations and engineering and all the supportive stuff like that. Like it's actually a big illusion that you can like focus on something and ignore everything else, because every little branch of science actually implicitly contains all of the rest of the science, and not even only science but other things like, I don't know, like culture in general, like how we perceive the world, how we describe it with our language and stuff like that. So I feel like when you're only starting, like it's like the middle of the, well, not the middle, like second half of the 17th century, then you absolutely have to try to grasp as much as possible in order to better shape at least some parts of it, if you know what I mean, like some parts of the science.
Right. Yeah, that's why I think Newton, with all, like I say, I would say he's definitely, that might be my opinion, I would say he was definitely the most well-read person in his day. For sure, he was up there. And yeah, there weren't as many books, so you could be not expert obviously, but read into a lot more areas. Like all those the minds that he had to work with at the time were like that too. People that we think of as great political philosophers in his day actually read his scientific work, and he read their political stuff in it. That's there really was a key group of minds in Europe at the time that he had to draw on, and they were well versed, and that's why they did have a more, I think, they were onto a more coherent world view if he didn't throw up his hands and say, I frame no hypothesis for gravity. That idea that they had was fitting with this idea of an infinite universe, infinite in scale, that did precede him, was around since Descartes anyhow, and that's really where they were going. That there are smaller scale, even particles than we can possibly detect, and that was a world view that got thrown out since then, and now we have this like almost preposterous idea. Basically we grew out of, again, almost like dark ages that happened in the 1900s. It just got worse, not better.
No, what do you mean by dark ages from 1900s?
Well, that's when we seem to have forgotten all the stuff that these people, like the idea of the Pleiades being a center, that was held by one of the greatest astronomers in Europe in the day. So where did that knowledge go? You and I now know that that's right, but a lot of these ideas weren't thrown away in antiquity. We went through. You can tell that when these guys were working on these ideas, they had read them somewhere, and they only were able maybe to verify them, if at best. But there was a lot, esoteric knowledge and ancient knowledge taken for granted that we could trust it. And then we got to this age where, like, Thunderbolts is kind of trying to break away from that, but that age where mythology is just made up stories, and ancient cultures, well, first of all, they weren't that ancient, so and they couldn't have known this stuff. That's not what people in the early 1900s believed. I mean, they didn't have these ideas of the ideas we have of evolution now. That's way more modern. The ideas that we have of Big Bang is way more modern, as opposed to an eternal universe. That got cemented very recently in history. This isn't, I think we're more dark age in our beliefs now. That's what taught as mainstream science now is actually more dark age than what they were teaching in the late 1800s, for example, and just in the way of looking at things.
Yeah. Well, I think there is a pretty understandable, like, cultural, at least some things you talk about have a pretty understandable cultural background. In particular, like when we're talking about, like, let's just for clarity compare like catastrophism versus, like, gradualism, or whatever you may call it. So one is stating that various super catastrophic events are possible and maybe even periodic, who knows. But whereas the other states that no, everything evolves pretty much like, in a very, very slow manner over like billions of years, roughly, something like that, right? So I think that the shift actually has a lot to do with, again, how our culture evolved, in particular in relation to nature. And what I mean by that is, like, after our technology, even like actually during the Industrial Revolution mostly, like, firstly, there was this idea of a world as a clockwork, right, by Thomas Hobbes, the clockwork metaphor for the world. And secondly, like, it evolved itself into this huge motion of Industrial Revolution where people started sort of like taming, in air quotes, the nature, or at least they thought they were. And now, like, the chaotic force became actually the man, the person, or humanity as a whole. And nature became this ordered mechanism, whereas previously it was almost the reverse, right? Nature was full of evil spirits that can kill you at any moment, and a person was very ordered with all the religious rituals, something like that. So this kind of cross shift occurred, and thus I think the gradualism gained much more cultural strength through that, because now we kind of understand, again in air quotes, or at least think we do understand that nature is actually sort of, a very mild creature that we are actually oppressing now, with all the ecological movements of 20th century, let's say. I mean, this understanding sort of radicalized itself, something like that. So, like, a deeper point I want to make is that I think that sometimes when you say things like that you imply that there is, again, some ill will behind this, whereas I'm trying to explain it with a broader, cultural processes. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, right. Yeah. I admit I'm a little shaped by my, like, well, it doesn't take much to see, like, if you keep it to politics, that maybe there's been an influence, at least since the world wars, to get pretty much of the world under one group. You just don't see that. You'd like to think that the science is immune from that whole thing, but obviously that's not.
Yeah, that's not at all what I'm saying. I'm actually saying that all the society is very, very interconnected, and basically the super remote parts of culture suddenly may resurface in some branch of science with like a double the previous force. Even like concepts from thousands of years ago can sometimes resurface like that.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, I see that happening with this whole, like, precession cycle that's going to drive up. When you find extinction cycles or Earth changes that happen that match periods that a different culture, matches their religious tradition, then it gets you to look at that, or and so on.
Yeah, pretty cool. There was probably something else I wanted to talk about, but I don't remember. Maybe you have some other remarks.
I'm not. I don't think so.
Yeah, I actually have to note that I've lost the first like 4 or 5 minutes of our discussion because I'm stupid. Like, basically, my program kind of glitched and I had to restart the recording. But for now, we're talking for 38 minutes on this recording. So
Yeah.
we might discuss something else as well, if you wish, if you have any ideas.
Oh, well, I just was. Yeah, the video I watched of yours most recently was on Ukraine, about how, like, you said, the people in your country were almost like ashamed of what happened with the Russians launching their invasions from there. I like hearing that take on, we get a side of the news here. Not that I watch it, but American news is different than what happens in a lot of places, basically.
Yeah, well, it's normal. It's like the news in any country would be other than the news in other countries. That's normal. And right now, actually, like with this whole war thing, it's kind of getting pretty bad in the sense that, nobody is shocked anymore. So people die every day still. but nobody kind of cares anymore because it's been like 2.5 months almost. And it's kind of bad.
Yeah, it's weird like that. I see the news. It kind of flip flopped here between. For a while, what we were getting mostly is news of Ukrainian successes against, Russian plane shot down, Russian ship.
Yeah.
So, like, Ukrainians are kicking butt and we don't have to do anything. That was kind of the story. And then all of a sudden it started turning a little bit different than that, that no, we better do something. And but I just thought it was kind of bizarre because I know it was a lot worse than when they were saying that the Ukrainians didn't need as much help, that, it was a little different than what we are seeing on the news here.
Oh, actually, I remembered what I wanted to talk about, but like I have an idea for a video specific. Like, I'll return to politics a little bit later. Okay, let's return to the times of Newton for a moment. So I've had this idea. I've relatively recently, let's say a couple of months ago, watched a video on alchemy. It was from the SIS, the Society for Interdisciplinary Studies, this British community, relatively adjacent to Electric Universe, but not quite. So what the guy in the video said, and I'll try to find the link and send it to you. Actually, I didn't even remember what he said, because I had my own idea while I was watching it. So the idea is that I've had the impression from his descriptions of alchemy that it was actually I don't want to use any uh, aggressive language or anything, but I don't know how to call it else, but like a primitive attempt at describing the world, in particular, like among other things, like chemical transmutations and stuff, like chemical reactions, with the kind of language that the people of that time and of that culture had. So they didn't have the vocabulary, of chemical elements like electron shells, chemical reactions. So they tried to describe it in whichever, whatever was available to them, which is this, let's say, symbolism of, I don't know, the sun and the moon and the man and the woman and stuff like that. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, but yeah, I think that I personally think that we had more knowledge once too, and a lot of it was handed down and kind of got lost in transcription. But yeah, like these ideas they had words for, well, like even earth, air, fire, water. When you look at that, it's actually more like solid, liquid, gas, plasma.
Yeah.
Dense states. But when you see some of the things that they're writing, these are clearly, especially with the fire, it's not someone else. Again, I'm not going to be able to quote the person that did it, but was talking about two words that a culture had for fire, and one of them was clearly combustion, but the other one was effectively electricity. And and you could see though that they didn't have quite that, wherever they got these descriptions. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with the Hermetica.
Well, you mean as a movement, like
No,
Hermes Trismegistus, or is that a book? Or?
Yeah, the book, and like the Emerald Tablet and the
You mean the works of these Italian guys like Marsilio Ficino and others, right? Like 15th century, basically.
well, yeah, the actual well, like if you look at,
Well, they've supposedly revived Platonic academia there, right? In Italy in 15th or 16th century, and they were doing a lot of alchemy there. That's basically, as far as I know, like the renaissance of alchemy.
Right. Like if you just read though, like the Emerald Tablet, just that text, it's not all that long, but when you realize it's not just a bunch of goofiness or esoteric stuff, it's really, I mean, it's physics, the way it's transmutations and well, the whole idea as above, so below, and all that. But it you can read it and reread it, and the physics just jumps out at you, and it's, to me, that's like probably, I always say this, that as above, so below is probably the first law of physics that you that you should know, and then from there you can take it. But that's really the beginning of a starting point for physics. Just that the whole tablet talks about transmutations in the earth, even, and where, it's not modern mainstream science for sure, but it fits with, with an understanding of EU. You already see some of these ideas kind of coming out of that. But
yeah, I don't know. I just randomly remembered that it's kind of irrelevant, but Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, so he was saying that basically it's convenient to subdivide the like okay, I wouldn't continue. It's too long and irrelevant. Sorry, but he basically underlines the importance of astronomy in the development of physics. He says that this was basically the first step, and I mean it kind of falls into the same bin as as above, so below. I mean, obviously not yours, but you know what I mean.
right. Yeah, see, that's when I think back when people were more aware of their environment and not just. I mean, it was obvious to people and just like almost intuitive that all these cycles affect, the day-night cycle, the seasonal cycle. I mean, obviously it affects us, and obviously it affects us in so many different ways that, if there were longer cycles, of course, they affect us, and maybe shorter cycles and cycles on different scales. I mean, that was like just a more intuitively obvious idea. And even if you look at astrology, and I have this advantage. My wife works for the American Federation of Astrologers, and it was established back in 1938, back when astrology and astronomy weren't so different. It was okay for an astronomer to write something on astrology, or the other way around, and astrology was obviously a lot more rigorous back then, and astronomy a lot less adverse to talking about any effects on us, than like they would now. But the books they had back in that library, you can see that they're using astrology fairly rigorously to look at all these different events in the world and explaining why these things would matter the way they do, and then with some, what I think is a good amount of success, and too much to be coincidental, for example, too. But that's all. Like now, if you even mention astrologist, you're a nut. Like for someone like me with a degree in astrophysics, if I say that there might be any truth to any of that, but that's because astrology itself has become that, what you read in the Sunday paper, that if you're a Sagittarius, you should hook up with this, and don't cross the street today because you might get, it's not rigorous.
Yeah,
that
but that's one part of the thing. But another one is like, what do you think about this conspirological take that all the secret societies and stuff are still heavily into astrology?
well, yeah, you can see that that's the case by who got astrological readings, and like during, kind of again around wartime, it got to be less apparent who was getting these readings, but and why. But they were a lot of people looked into astrology. A lot of world leaders trusted their astrologers, um, and psychics too. Like I don't know if you're familiar with Edgar Cayce. He's probably the most documented psychic in the world. The one that was like hardest for anybody to try to debunk. But he gave readings for presidents. I mean, that's somewhere that, and obviously, if you're doing that, I mean, you could see that even if you were a world leader, you would use any resource you had, whether it was, even if you had the attitude, why not? What can it hurt? An
Yeah.
astrologer or a psychic is going to give me advice. But then if they gave you something that you would obviously want to keep that secret if it was going to be to your advantage, especially in a wartime, you know, or if
Yeah.
it was going to a threat to you or something, then, but yeah, if this part I will say, and rather than say whether it's true or not, if there is any truth to any of that, you could count on somebody not wanting, somebody in power not wanting people to know, and also diluting what does get out there, making,
Mhm.
you would want, if you believe the astrology worked, you would want the masses to not believe that it worked. You would want them to have the crappiest stuff out there. And the same with psychic, if there were any good psychics or good channelers, you would want the masses to think that that stuff was all just stupid
Mhm.
and have the charlatans out there.
Yeah, makes sense. And with regards to that, like I was specifically aiming at this little subject. What do you think about a hypothesis, let's call it that, when Pluto was discovered, like a lot of astrologers were pissed off because, well, now they have to account for another planet. So it was demoted because of that eventually.
Oh, yeah.
High-level astrologists, like from all these secret societies we're talking about, and maybe there was even an argument between like different schools of thought out there, internal argument, so to speak. So eventually, Pluto was kicked out, and one school has won, basically.
Yeah, that would be interesting to consider, like what the effects would be like from of that in the astrological stuff, that you would want not to have that be part of it too.
Yeah, it's just an interesting thought I've heard somewhere. Okay, so do you want to add anything to that? Because like I have a small topic to finish it off.
Oh yeah, go ahead. I'm good.
All right. So it's regarding the following events. We've already discussed the war, right? But now people are seriously talking about the coming famine, right? The next
Mhm.
horseman, so to speak. So what do you think about that? Because like I'm already reading in the news that some like food production plants started blowing up and stuff. So in the US, I mean,
Oh yeah, our like food. There's so much going on that it's almost hard to keep track of. Like, but very generally, yeah, food prices just are skyrocketing more than normal inflation and more than the inflation of everything else. I mean, fuel and food are just kind of crazy here, in increases, but also shortages that were, I mean, there was stuff blamed on COVID, but a lot of it's just a lot of weirdness in what gets shut down too. That might be me with
Mhm.
more conspiratorial ideas on
Uh,
what's happening. But they're
Well, I can say that COVID actually helped, and it was clear that it would, that a lot of people would become incredibly poor, and probably some people would starve to death, especially in poorer regions like Africa specifically, and maybe parts of Asia and maybe South America, I don't know. It was clear already in like March of 2020, and even I talked about this in my video from back then. So, but now it seems like it's almost like in the air, you know? Like two things are in the air. It's like the nuclear war and the coming famine, as I feel
right.
it.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nasty. I would prefer a famine probably, but I'm not sure actually. That depends on the scale. Maybe
Right.
nuclear war would be better.
Yeah. I see that as almost in, inevitable, though. Like the nuclear stuff. But that's again, we could save that for another time. That's more off the record. But
Yeah, sure.
I just,
Well, I mean, I can stop the record right now and we can still talk about it.
okay. Yep. If you don't mind, there's some stuff
Yeah,
that
okay. Well, let's just formally say goodbye to every
okay.
listener.
Yeah.
Yeah, we haven't had an introduction because I screwed up, but yeah, at least thanks for everyone to listening to that.
Yeah. Yes. Thanks. And thank you
Yeah,
for
thank you as well.